let's talk about parrying in Elden Ring. Parrying is a high-risk, high-reward maneuver that allows you to deflect an enemy's attack and stance break them for a critical hit. However, the mechanic is relatively underused, and it's not really a surprise why. Nothing else in the game feels even remotely similar. Take dodge rolls for instance. When you dodge roll, the moment you input, you immediately become invulnerable to damage. This means for almost all attacks in the game, you can reactively input your dodge right before the attacks hit you, and you will most likely avoid the attacks. By comparison, parrying has a lot of nuances that the game never tells you. For starters, not all attacks can be parried. If the enemy isn't using a weapon, or is several times larger than you, you most likely can't parry them. In addition to this limitation, parries also have a startup animation before they gain their active frames. Active frames refers to the part of the parry animation during which you want the enemy's attacks to connect with you. You can think of these like the equivalent of iframes for your parry. Because of this startup lag, you have to preemptively input your parry before the enemy attacks in order for it to be successful. And to top it all off, all parries are not created equal. In Elden Ring, there are 6 types of parries: weapon, medium shield, dagger, small shield, golden parry, and carry and retaliation. As of patch 1.12, all parries were changed to have the same number of startup frames with 8. However, each of the parries still have varying numbers of active frames. Now, if you've seen anything about parry frames before, you might find these numbers a bit odd. You might even recall golden parry and carry and retaliation as having 14 active frames in the past. However, after going through and verifying the parry hitboxes of all the parries, I can guarantee you that these numbers are correct. So, with this updated frame data in mind, which parry should you use? Considering our options, if you're going to be using a shield, there's basically no reason not to use carry and retaliation on a medium shield, as it has the best active frames with no FP cost as long as you're not blocking a spell. And since there's no downside to using it on a medium shield, you can still get the 100% physical damage block of a medium shield. If you're having trouble maintaining a close enough distance to parry, you could switch to using golden parry, which, even though it is massively nerfed from its former glory, the extra range opens up a variety of new parry angles that would have been otherwise unavailable. The main downsides are the lackluster 7 active frames and the FP cost on every use, which for builds that lack mind can be quite the heavy burden on your meager FP reserves. Okay, let me come in here real quick and talk about Stormwall and Thop's Barrier since I forgot to address them earlier. Stormwall has 10 active frames and also lets you block incoming physical projectiles. Like Golden Parry, it also consumes FP on each use. Stormwall has some extremely niche uses, but overall I wouldn't recommend using Stormwall over Carry and Retaliation as a general option. As for Thop's Barrier, some sources, such as the Fextralife Wiki, claim this parry has only 6 startup frames. But this is false. These 6 startup frames are only for the spell barrier. The actual parry still has 8 startup frames in line with everything else. Aside from that misconception, the parry has 9 parry frames and I would generally say is for most players a worse version of carry and retaliation. Obviously the spell parry has some niche uses, but for the average player I'd still recommend carry and retaliation. As for weapon parries, the main benefit is that it lets you power stance a weapon for increased DPS. However, if DPS is your goal, I would not trade out a more powerful weapon Ash for an inconsistent 5-frame parry. The last thing to discuss is dagger parries, which I do think are the only realistically viable weapon parries. And you're not just gated to power stancing daggers, as certain daggers can be power stanced with other weapon types. Now that you've picked a parry of choice, it's time to actually parry some attacks. So, how do you figure out the parry timing on an attack? Well, it's a lot of trial and error, but a general rule of thumb is to keep your eyes on the enemy's hand and input right as they begin their attack motion. This will result in a pretty consistent success against the vast majority of enemies. But if you're someone who doesn't want to spend all that time learning each and every of the Shadow of the Erdtree bosses, have no fear. From this point forward in the video, I will be discussing the specific parry timings of every single parryable attack from the 5 parryable DLC Remembrance bosses. Let's start with the first of those bosses that you will most likely encounter in the DLC, and my personal favorite boss, Rellana the Twin Moon Knight. Rellana is very akin to Malenia from the base game, in that she is extremely agile and fast in her onslaught. She requires 2 parries to stance break, and for parry users, she will absolutely skill check your reaction time. A general rule of thumb is to always keep your eyes on her left hand, as all of her fastest attacks come from her left hand, and all of her other attacks are delayed enough for you to react anyways. So, without further ado, let's start with her easiest moves to parry. In my opinion, the easiest moves to parry are the side dash slashes. There are 2 variations of this move, one for either direction, and both have basically the same parry timing. For the right side dash, you want to input at the end of the dash just as she begins twisting her body for the attack. If you're having trouble with this timing, you can also watch her legs and input right as you see her left leg appear out from behind her. For the left side dash, the same strategies apply. Input right as she begins to twist her body for the attack. The left leg trick also works here, although the leg is always visible from this side, so you instead want to input right as you see the leg about to touch the ground. Her next easiest parry is the dual overhead slash. This move has a long windup, and so the parry is very straightforward. You want to input here, as her hand reaches the peak of its height. If you're having trouble determining the peak of her hand, you can instead watch her backhand and input right as her backhand disappears from view behind her. The last of her easy parries is another one of her core moves, the overhead slash. For this attack, you want to input right as her arm covers her face. This attack can also be parried a second way though, as if you're standing close enough to her, the first swing will go over your head, allowing you to parry the second swing rather than the first. This is generally unnecessary as it's easier to just parry the first attack, but if you want to get some style points, stand point blank to her and input right here as her left arm forms a straight line with her right sword. This will parry the second slash with the first slash going over your head. Now, moving on to her gap closers. If you find yourself at some distance from Rellana, she is likely to use one of 3 moves to close the gap. First, let's talk about the Dash Flurry. For this move, you want to input right as Rellana's left sword is nearing parallel with the ground. The timing on this particular parry is pretty forgiving though, since as long as your parry is on timing for either the first or second slash in this move, you will successfully parry the attack. The next of her common gap closers is the cross up slash. For this one, you want to input right as her arms become parallel behind her back. If she's too far from you when she initiates this move, you can roll the first attack and instead parry the second slash, inputting right here as she finishes crossing her arms to attack. The last of her main gap closers is the Glintblade Phalanx dash. For this one, dodge through the Glintblades and input your parry here, right as she begins to swing her right hand down towards you. And now for her 2 final and most difficult to parry attacks. The first is this quick thrust attack. For this one, you need to input right here, right as she reaches the end of her left arm's windup. There's no other special tip for this one, you're just going to have to react fast and input on timing. Her final parryable move is the quick up slash. This move's windup starts pretty similar to the quick thrust, but comes out twice as fast. For this move, you need to input right here. Although, for most players, you will basically need to input as soon as you register that she's doing this move. Otherwise, you won't have your parry out on timing. Both of these moves are the reason I say to constantly be watching her left hand, as you need to give yourself the most amount of time possible to react to them. And with that, that's all for Rellana. She uses all these moves in both Phase 1 and 2. And in terms of the 4 moves she gains in Phase 2, none of them are able to be parried. So, with Rellana covered, it's time to move on to the next boss and step into the fire with Midra, Lord of the Frenzied Flame. Compared to Rellana, Midra is an extremely tame parry fight. He is much slower and more predictable than Rellana is, with very obvious tells on almost all his attacks. He requires 3 parries to stance break and only has 1 relatively difficult parry, which I will of course save for last. So, starting out with his first parryable move, the upward slash. For this move you want to input right before he begins to swing his sword horizontally. An easy tell is to input when the hilt of his sword appears out from behind his head. Next up are Midra's downward slashes. Midra has 2 variations of this move that have virtually the same timing. Let's first start with the left to right variation of this move. For this variant, you want to input right here, right before he starts swinging his sword. Similar to the upward slash, an easy tell is to watch the hilt and input when the hilt appears from behind his head. For the other variant of this move, you want to input as he's about to swing right here. There's not a super easy tell, but this move has enough of a windup that it's not too hard to learn the timing. For the last of his common moves is the horizontal sweep. For this move, you want to input right here as his sword becomes perpendicular to the camera. Now that I've covered his 4 main parryable moves, let's talk about the thing that makes Midra such a predictable parry fight. After a successful parry that doesn't stance break, Midra will almost always follow up with one of 3 moves. His grab, a thrust attack, or a flame burst into an overhead slash. Of these 3, the last 2 are parryable, so let's first look at the thrust attack. For the thrust, like most of his attacks, you want to input right before his swing, right here. He does occasionally use this move as a standalone too, but you are much more commonly going to see it as a follow-up attack. As for his other parryable follow-up, the Flame Burst, which is immediately followed by an overhead slash. For this one, you want to dodge the fire, and then you want to input your parry here, right after his arm passes his head. Now, before I move on to the Phase 2 attacks, I'm going to cover one non-parryable attack that is particularly hard to dodge if he uses it point blank, the helicopter. Now, if you try to dodge roll this attack when he uses it while you're point blank, he might roll catch you. But since you were already point blank to him, you can actually just crouch underneath the entire attack. Moving on to Phase 2, he gains 2 new parryable moves. Starting with the easier of the 2, the Flame Sweep. For this move, you want to input right here, right after he leans all the way in to attack you. This one is pretty straightforward, although you do need to be careful, as I've found that this attack will sometimes still cast its Flame Wave even on a successful parry. However, as long as you don't step backwards into the Flame Wave, it shouldn't hit you in this case. And now for the hardest parry in this fight, the Flame Overhead. Now, this move isn't hard to parry because it's super fast like Rellana's Quick Slash, but rather because there's no easy way to tell when to parry, and the timing always feels rather off. For this one, you need to input right here. The easiest tell I can find is that his body starts swaying towards you here, but it's not a very obvious tell. This attack also occasionally has the same issue as the Flame Sweep. Although, if the Flame Wave gets spawned on a successful parry of this attack, you're just fucked, and it will hit you. And that's everything for Midra. A very straightforward parry fight with relatively easy parries. Now it's time for Messmer the Impaler. Messmer is definitely one of my favorite boss fights of all time. He's also definitely one of the parry fights of all time. For some inexplicable reason, Messmer has a lot of moves that seem like they should be parryable that aren't, and he plays distance in a way that can make landing parries rather difficult. To compensate for this, I'll be giving timings on more than just his combo openers, since you can't always get solid opportunities to parry the combo openings. Let's start with what I would call his bread and butter combo, the Flame Spear combo. The opening parry is pretty simple. You want to input here, right before he rapidly swings forward. You can also watch his empty hand and input when it's just about reaching the ground. If he uses this move from afar though, you want to roll through the first strike and parry the second attack, inputting here, as he lowers his spear before the attack. If you're too far to close the gap to parry either of the first two moves, you most likely just want to keep your distance and avoid the attack. You can technically parry the rising thrust, but I generally wouldn't recommend going for it since it imposes unnecessary risks that you don't really need to take. Next up on his list of common combos, the Flame Hand Thrust attack. There are two ways to parry the first attack, the normal way and the cool way. The normal way is to roll forward through the flames and input your parry here, right after he starts swinging his empty hand downward. If you're standing right next to him, your roll forward may put you slightly behind him, so make sure to walk back into proper parrying position. Now the cooler way to do this is to actually not roll at all and literally just walk backwards slightly to avoid the flames, then walk back through the flames to parry the stab. There is also two other flame hand variations. There is this variation which is not parryable and needs to be dodged. The indicator is that this flame hand goes from top right to bottom left, whereas the parryable version is inverted. The other variant of the flame hand occurs if you ever find yourself behind Messmer. And for this timing, you want to input right here as his spear starts to tilt downward. Next up, let's talk about what looks like a really difficult parry, but actually might be the easiest parry in the fight, the Flame Tornado. For this parry, with your camera locked on, roll forward through the first swing, and then after your camera snaps 180 degrees, roll forward again, putting you into parry position. You then want to input right here, right before he swings upward. I can't really explain why, but this parry feels extremely intuitive to me. You can almost always perform this exact maneuver to parry this move, regardless of distance from him, so long as he's not across the entire arena from you, which should basically never happen. Messmer has 3 different thrust attacks he commonly does. So let's start with the easiest of the 3 to parry, the Charged Thrust. Messmer uses this move to conclude a variety of his combos, but he also does it as a standalone. For the standalone version, he will very commonly do this from a decent distance, making it hard to actually be in position to parry. But if you're able to get into position, you want to input here, right at the end of his windup. The next thrust attack is the Lunge, which you will often use to close the gap on you. To parry this one, you want to input here, right as his empty hand pans across the middle of his body. If he uses this move from too far away though, you cannot parry it and instead should roll, at which point he will transition into a Flame Hand Thrust, which should be easy to parry. The last of his thrust attacks is the Quick Stabs. Like the Charged Thrust, he usually starts this move from a distance, but if you're close enough, you can parry the first thrust by inputting right here before his stab. If you are too far from him, however, you can still parry the follow-up. Roll forward and slightly to the left of Messmer to avoid both stabs, and then input your parry here, right as Messmer begins to turn around to swing. And for the last of Messmer's parries, and the hardest in the fight, the Quick Slashes. This move is difficult to parry for a few reasons. 1. It's really fast. It's not quite as fast as Rellana's equivalent, but it's still very difficult to react to. And 2. Messmer has another move that's just as fast, looks similar, and is not parryable, meaning it's very easy to misread the attack and try to parry something you shouldn't have. So, to parry this move, you want to input right here, right before Messmer swings down. But if you can't react in time to parry this one, no worries. Instead, just roll backwards twice to avoid both swings, at which point Messmer will either follow up with the Flame Tornado or his Flame Spear combo, both of which can be parried the same way as when they were standalone moves. That's all of the parries for Messmer, as all of his Phase 2 attacks are not parryable. And while he does keep all of these moves into Phase 2, he greatly favors the Lunge and Flame Tornado since he likes to move around so much in Phase 2. The next boss on the list is Romina, and Romina is an interesting parry fight because she only has 4 parryable moves and requires 1 parry to stance break. The first of her parries is the Rot Slash. For this one, you want to input your parry here, as she leans in to attack you. An easy tell is to parry off the sound cue of her empowering her weapon. Her next parry is the Drive-By Slash. To parry it, you want to input right here, right as she starts walking forward. Next up, let's talk about the most important parry in this fight, the Slash and Dash. This is Romina's most common parry since she almost always uses it whenever she's at a distance. To parry it, sprint away from the first slash and turn around and follow her slash's afterimage to close the gap. You then want to input your parry here right before her swing. You do have to make sure you end up in the right position or else her swing will just miss you and you will lose out on the parry opportunity. Her last parry is what I'm going to call Romina's Assault, where she does this long multi-swing, multi-attack combo. To parry this move, run past the centipede and underneath her to end up in front of her spear. The first swing will go over you, at which point you want to input your parry here, right before her second swing. Alternatively, if you're too far to run underneath her legs, step back slightly to avoid the centipede, then roll forward into her to put yourself into parry position before inputting on the same timing as before. And just like that, we're already done with everything for Romina. She's pretty simple and straightforward of a boss. And with her done, I've of course saved the best for last. It's time for the promised consort himself. I know I'm gonna be in the minority when I say this, and maybe I'm biased because I've only ever fought him as a parry fight, but I really liked the Radahn fight. From a parry fight perspective, he's actually really reasonable, and he has 2 of the coldest parries in the game to boot. But enough about my Stockholm Syndrome, let's get into his Phase 1. Starting with the easiest parry, the Overhead Slash. For Radahn's Overhead Slash variant, you want to input here, right as his hand goes behind his head. Next up, let's talk about his right hand slash. This is one of his most important moves to have down since he very often follows up on a successful parry with this move. To parry it, input your parry here, right after he begins leaning in towards you. Another one of his common parry follow-up attacks is the Bloodflame Slash. To parry, input here, as Radahn has his arm drawn all the way back. Another tell is that he starts leaning forward slightly here. Next up, let's talk about the Cross Slash. For this one, you want to input here, right as he starts stepping downward with his left foot. The next 2 moves are 2 of his less common moves. First, the Underhand Slash. This move is hard to read because Radahn's cape obscures the timing. To parry it, you want to input right here. This one is definitely more of a timing one, as I can't find a very good tell for it. The second of his less common moves is the dual side slash. This move is only commonly seen as a standalone move right after he is stance broken. But he does have another move that looks similar to this move but is not parryable. If he raises his hands all the way up, it's not parryable. If it's to the side, it's parryable. As for the timing, you want to input right here after he leans all the way in towards you. And lastly for phase 1, the triple slash. This is the hardest phase 1 parry in the fight, although compared to Rellana and Messmer's quick slashes, this one is nothing. To parry it, input right here as he starts swinging his sword. Now for phase 2, which keeps all of the former parries, but also adds 2 new parryable moves, which might be 2 of the coolest and most difficult parries in the entire game. Let's start with the easier of the 2, the Afterimage dash. Both of these phase 2 parries require very precisely timed dodge rolls, since you have to input buffer your parry into the roll in order to parry on time. So, to parry the Afterimage dash, you want to roll straight forward through the clone and input your parry in the middle of your roll so that it comes out as soon as your roll's recovery frames are finished. The best timing explanation I can give for this is that you should roll right here when the clone Afterimages are lined up diagonally across like this. Another way to put it is that you need to roll early enough that you can get your parry active on time, while still being late enough that you don't get hit by any of the clones. This parry can be done from any distance, as no matter where Radahn starts this move from, he always snaps directly in front of you, making this parry always doable. The last note I want to give about this parry is that while it is technically not terrain dependent, in that the arena's uneven terrain will never make this parry impossible, if Radahn is on a piece of terrain higher than you, the timing on this parry becomes more forgiving, as you can roll earlier than before and still hit the parry. And now for the piece de resistance, the most badass parry in the game. Just like the previous parry, this one requires a very precise dodge roll into a buffered parry to do consistently. The major difference is that this parry is basically frame perfect. So, in slow motion first, as Radahn jumps up, the first thing you want to do is walk forward right. If you're a keyboard user like myself, you want to hold W and D down. You then, right as the second Afterimage firmly plants his feet on the ground, you want to dodge roll in that same forward right direction. Then, you input buffer your parry, and boom, move parried. And now in full speed. So, how do you do it consistently in the actual fight? I found my solution is to, rather than try and react to when the second clone's feet are hitting the ground, which is impossible because that's not how reaction speed works, I watch Radahn up in the air and input once I react to the second clone leaving his body, since that timing about lines up with the correct timing for the dodge roll. And now for some notes about this parry. Very often, when you hit this parry, Miquella's laser follow-ups will still go off. However, I have not once ever been actually hit by them. They seem to get spawned with no hitbox, and so you don't need to worry about them. Another thing you might be wondering about is how consistent is this parry? Is it affected by terrain, distance, etc.? And the answer is, it is consistent, in that it is always doable, regardless of terrain or distance. But the timing is slightly more forgiving when you are on even terrain and when you are closer to Radahn when he takes off. To prove its consistency, watch me hit it 6 times in a row here. And I also did go through and test in slow motion at various height points and distances all around the arena, and it was always doable in my testing. Of course, there's no way for me to be 100% sure if there aren't outliers at some place in the arena, but if I couldn't find it in 4 straight hours of testing, you probably won't be seeing it in your average Radahn attempts. And that's everything for this video. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that normal YouTube stuff. If you want to support me further, I also have a Patreon where I'll be uploading some of the behind the scenes stuff if that interests you. But anyways, thanks for watching.